Evangeline Thorne pressed her back against the heavy oak door as thunder shook the entire structure. Water dripped from her soaked hair onto the marble floor, creating small puddles that reflected the dim lighting from an ornate chandelier overhead. She had expected to find a security guard or at least a reception desk in what the faded brass plaque outside had indicated was the Crimson Hall Historic Museum. Instead, she found herself in what looked like someone's private library. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. Evangeline grabbed her phone, but the screen showed no signal. The storm had knocked out cell towers across Shadowmere Heights, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. She should leave, find a proper hotel, but the rain was coming down in sheets, and her rental car had stalled 3 blocks away. "You're trespassing." The voice came from behind her, low and controlled. Evangeline spun around to find a man standing in the shadows near a massive bookshelf. Even in the dim light, she could see he was tall, probably 6'2", wearing an expensive dark suit that fit him perfectly. His black hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes seemed to cut right through her. "I'm sorry, I thought this was a museum." The sign outside. Evangeline started, but he stepped closer, and she could see his expression clearly now. There was something dangerous about the way he looked at her, like a predator deciding whether she was prey or simply an annoyance. "The museum closed permanently 2 years ago. This is a private residence." His voice carried an edge that made her pulse quicken, but not entirely from fear. "How did you get in?" "The front door was unlocked. Look, I'm not here to steal anything. My car broke down in the storm, and I just needed shelter until it passes." Evangeline lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the fact that she was clearly at a disadvantage. "I'm Evangeline Thorne. I work for the city planning department." Something shifted in his expression when she mentioned her name, but it passed so quickly she might have imagined it. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her soaked blazer, the way her auburn hair clung to her face, the determination in her green eyes despite her obvious discomfort. "Damien Valerian." He didn't extend his hand or make any move to welcome her. "And you picked the wrong house to break into during a storm." Evangeline had heard that name before. Every resident of Shadowmere Heights knew the Valerian name, though usually it was whispered rather than spoken aloud. They owned half the businesses in town, and the other half paid them protection money. Or so the rumors went. "I didn't break in." The door was open, and there was a museum plaque. She gestured toward the entrance, but her words trailed off when she saw his expression darken. That plaque should have been removed months ago. Damien moved to a window and peered out at the storm. Lightning illuminated his profile, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. "The storm won't pass for hours. The roads will be flooded. Then I'll wait in my car." "Your car that broke down 3 blocks away?" When she stared at him in surprise, he almost smiled. "This is a small town, Miss Thorne. Word travels fast, especially when a stranger shows up asking questions about historic properties." A chill ran down Evangeline's spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "You've been watching me. I make it my business to know who's poking around city records, especially when they're asking about properties that certain people would prefer to keep private." Damien turned away from the window and faced her fully. "The question is what exactly the city planning department wants with buildings that have been in private hands for over a century." Evangeline reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a waterproof folder. "I'm conducting historical assessments for potential landmark designation. Crimson Hall is on the preliminary list due to its architectural significance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Damien's eyes fixed on the folder in her hands with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Landmark designation. It's just a preliminary survey. Nothing's been decided yet." Evangeline clutched the folder tighter. "The city wants to preserve buildings with significant historical value before developers." "Before developers what?" "Tear them down. Turn them into shopping centers." Damien's voice was deadly quiet now. "Or before the government finds excuses to seize private property through eminent domain." "That's not what this is about, isn't it?" He took a step closer, and Evangeline could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her strangely aware of how alone they were. "You show up in my town, asking questions about my property, carrying official city documents. Then you conveniently end up trapped in my house during a storm. Are you suggesting I planned this?" I'm suggesting that people who dig into things that don't concern them in Shadowmere Heights tend to find more than they bargained for. Thunder crashed overhead, punctuating his words. Evangeline realized that her heart was racing, but not entirely from fear. There was something about Damien Valerian that drew her in even as every instinct told her to run. The way he moved with predatory grace, the intelligence in his steel blue eyes, the sense of barely controlled power that seemed to radiate from him. "The storm will pass," she said finally. "I'll leave first thing in the morning." Damien studied her for another long moment, then walked to a cabinet and poured himself a glass of something amber-colored from a crystal decanter. "You'll stay in the East Wing. Second floor, third door on the right. Mrs. Chun will bring you dry clothes and something to eat." He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Don't wander. This house has a tendency to be dangerous for people who don't know their way around." Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the East Wing bedroom, where Evangeline had spent a restless night. The storm had passed, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain and the sound of water dripping from the mansion's elaborate gutters. She dressed in the clothes Mrs. Chun had provided the night before, a simple black dress that fit surprisingly well and low heels that were only slightly too big. The hallway outside her room stretched in both directions, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men and women who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than posed for eternity on these walls. Following the scent of coffee and bacon, Evangeline made her way toward what she hoped was the kitchen or dining room. She found Damien seated at a mahogany table that could easily accommodate 12 people, reading a newspaper while drinking coffee from bone china. He'd changed from last night's suit into dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. The casual clothes should have made him seem more approachable, but somehow they only emphasized the controlled strength in his movements. "Your car has been towed to Morrison's garage," he said without looking up from his paper. "Jake says it'll need a new alternator. 2 days, maybe 3 if he has to order the part." Evangeline stopped in the doorway. "How do you know about my car?" "I told you. Word travels fast in this town." Damien folded the newspaper and set it aside, finally meeting her eyes. "Coffee." An elderly Asian woman emerged from what Evangeline assumed was the kitchen, carrying a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. She set it down at the place setting across from Damien with efficient movements, then poured coffee into a waiting cup. "Thank you, Mrs. Chun," Evangeline said. But the woman just nodded curtly and disappeared back through the kitchen door without a word. "She doesn't talk to strangers," Damien explained. "Nothing personal. She's worked for my family for 30 years and still doesn't trust anyone who hasn't been properly vetted." Evangeline sat down and took a sip of the coffee. It was excellent, dark and rich with just a hint of something she couldn't identify. Vetted by whom? By me. The simple answer carried weight that made Evangeline glance around the dining room with new eyes. Everything was expensive but not ostentatious, carefully chosen to project power without flashiness. Even the flowers in the center of the table looked like they'd been arranged by a professional. "I need to call the city office," she said, pulling out her phone. The signal was strong now that the storm had passed. "Let them know about the delay." "Already taken care of." Damien reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to her. "I spoke with Director Hammond this morning. Explained that you'd been caught in the storm and that your car needed repairs." Evangeline stared at the card. It was her supervisor's direct line. "You called my boss." "I called the city planning office and asked to speak with whoever was in charge of the historical assessment project. Hammond was quite concerned about your welfare." Damien's tone was neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested amusement. "He seemed particularly interested when I mentioned that Crimson Hall was on your evaluation list." A cold knot formed in Evangeline's stomach. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're safe, that your car broke down, and that I'd be happy to cooperate with the city's assessment since it appears to be legally mandated." Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction. "He was very grateful for my civic-minded attitude." Evangeline set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "You manipulated the situation." "I responded to the situation. There's a difference." Damien stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Your director was quite clear that the assessment is part of a federal grant program. Refusing to cooperate could result in penalties or increased scrutiny from other government agencies." So you're agreeing to the assessment to avoid problems with the feds. I'm agreeing to the assessment because I don't have a choice. But that doesn't mean I have to like it, or that I trust your motives. Mrs. Chun returned with a fresh pot of coffee, but this time she was followed by a younger man in work clothes who moved with the careful deference of someone accustomed to being around dangerous people. He whispered something to Damien in what sounded like Spanish. "Tell Rodriguez to handle it personally," Damien replied quietly. "And make sure the paperwork is filed today." The man nodded and left quickly, but not before casting a nervous glance in Evangeline's direction. Mrs. Chun refilled both coffee cups and retreated to the kitchen again, her movements sharp with what looked like disapproval. "Your staff seems nervous around strangers," Evangeline observed. "My staff understands the importance of discretion." Damien returned to his seat, but his posture was more alert now, as if the brief conversation had reminded him of things that required his attention. "This house has been in my family for 4 generations. We value our privacy. And your privacy is worth more than historical preservation? My privacy is worth more than government interference in my personal affairs." Damien's voice hardened. "But since you're here, and since I apparently have no choice in the matter, we might as well get this assessment over with efficiently." Evangeline pulled a tablet from her bag and opened the assessment application. "I'll need to photograph the exterior and interior, document architectural details, research the property's history, and interview you about any renovations or changes made to the original structure. The house was built in 1887 by my great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Valerian. It's been continuously occupied by my family since then. No major structural changes, though we've updated the electrical and plumbing systems over the years." Damien spoke with the practiced ease of someone who'd given this information before. "I have all the original blueprints and construction records if you need them." "That would be helpful." Evangeline made notes on her tablet, trying to ignore the way his voice seemed to rumble in his chest when he spoke. "What about the grounds? Any outbuildings or structures that might be historically significant?" "There's a carriage house that's been converted to a garage, a greenhouse that my grandmother used for her orchids, and a few storage buildings. Nothing that would interest historians." Mrs. Chun appeared again, this time carrying a leather portfolio which she set next to Damien's place setting. He opened it and began reviewing what looked like business documents, occasionally making notes in the margins with a fountain pen. "Do you work from home?" Evangeline asked. "I work from wherever business requires me to be." Damien signed one of the documents and moved it to a separate pile. "Today that happens to be here, making sure you get everything you need for your assessment." The way he said it made it clear that his presence wasn't entirely about being helpful. He was watching her, making sure she didn't see anything she wasn't supposed to see. The question was what exactly he thought she might find in a house that was supposedly just a private residence. Evangeline finished her breakfast and closed her tablet. "I'd like to start with the exterior, if that's all right. Get photos of the facade and architectural details while the light is good." "Of course." Damien stood as well, buttoning his shirt cuffs with precise movements. "I'll give you the tour myself. Make sure you don't miss anything important." The mansion's library occupied most of the second floor's west wing, with floor-to-ceiling shelves that held what appeared to be centuries' worth of books, documents, and ledgers. Evangeline had been photographing architectural details for 2 hours when she noticed the filing cabinets built into the wall behind a massive oak desk. They were clearly original to the house, with brass hardware that matched the door fixtures throughout the mansion. Property records are kept in those cabinets. Damien had explained earlier before excusing himself to take a phone call that had lasted much longer than expected. "Feel free to document whatever you need for the historical assessment." Evangeline opened the first drawer, expecting to find deeds and property surveys. Instead, she discovered a meticulous filing system that appeared to chronicle not just Crimson Hall's history, but the entire development of Shadowmere Heights over the past century. The files were organized by decade, with subcategories for major families, businesses, and what appeared to be newspaper clippings. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Local Press Coverage 2005 to 2010 and spread its contents across the desk. Most of the articles dealt with city council meetings, property developments, and social events. But one section caught her attention. A series of investigative pieces from the Shadowmere Heights Chronicle, all written by the same journalist, Marcus Thorne. Evangeline's hands trembled as she recognized her father's byline. She hadn't seen his name in print since she was 14 years old, when the newspaper had run his obituary after the car accident that killed him. But here were articles she'd never known existed, investigative pieces that detailed a web of connections between local politicians, construction companies, and what he'd termed private security firms that seemed to operate with unusual autonomy. The most recent article was dated just 2 weeks before his death. It focused on a proposed waterfront development project that would have required the demolition of several historic buildings in the old downtown district. According to her father's reporting, the project had been fast-tracked through city approval despite significant environmental concerns and community opposition. The Steinberg Group's influence over city planning decisions raises serious questions about the transparency of the approval process, her father had written. Sources within City Hall report that planning commissioners received substantial campaign contributions from companies affiliated with the development project, creating potential conflicts of interest that warrant federal investigation. Evangeline photographed the article with her phone, then continued reading. Her father had been building a case that the Steinberg family, who owned the largest construction company in the region, had been using intimidation tactics against property owners who refused to sell their land for development projects. Several business owners had reported receiving visits from representatives who suggested that cooperation would be better for everyone involved. More troubling are reports that the Steinberg organization has formed partnerships with local families whose businesses provide what city records describe as security consulting services. The article continued. These partnerships appear designed to circumvent legal restrictions on how construction companies can pressure property owners. The next folder contained documents that made Evangeline's blood run cold. Police reports about her father's accident, but also insurance company investigations that had been closed without resolution. According to the insurance investigators' notes, Marcus Thorne's car had left the road during clear weather on a stretch of highway he'd driven hundreds of times. The brake lines had been severed, but the insurance company had ruled it inconclusive whether the damage occurred before or during the accident. Finding everything you need for your assessment? Evangeline spun around to find Damien standing in the library doorway. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes moved immediately to the papers spread across the desk. She could see the exact moment when he recognized what she was reading. These are articles by Marcus Thorne. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. My father. Damien closed the door behind him and walked slowly toward the desk. I wondered when you'd find those. You knew? Evangeline stood up, her heart pounding. You knew who I was when I showed up here last night. I suspected. Damien reached the desk and glanced down at the police reports. Evangeline Thorne isn't exactly a common name, and you have his eyes. Same green color, same expression when you're determined to get answers. My father died 15 years ago in a car accident. Your father died 15 years ago because he was asking the wrong questions about the wrong people. Damien's voice was matter of fact, but there was something underneath it that might have been regret. He'd been investigating connections between the Steinberg family and various local businesses. He was getting close to proving things that certain people didn't want proven. Evangeline picked up one of the insurance reports. This says his brake lines were cut. They were. The insurance company was encouraged to close the investigation quickly and quietly. Damien sat down in the chair across from the desk, his movements careful and controlled. Your father was a good journalist, but he underestimated how far some people would go to protect their interests. Some people like you. Some people like the Steinbergs. Damien's jaw tightened. My family's business has always operated in gray areas, Miss Thorne. We provide services that help people solve problems when traditional legal channels prove inadequate. But we don't kill journalists for asking questions. Evangeline sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was hearing. The city sent me here to assess this house for historical designation. But they knew, didn't they? They knew about these files. I doubt Director Hammond knows anything about what's in those cabinets. But someone higher up the chain might have suggested that a thorough historical assessment of the Valerian property would be in the city's best interests. Damien leaned forward, his expression intense. The question is whether you're here because someone wants to know what information I have, or because someone wants to know what you might discover about your father's death. I don't understand. Your father was building a case against the Steinbergs when he died. He had sources, documents, evidence that could have destroyed their organization and sent several city officials to prison. Damien gestured toward the files on the desk. Some of that evidence ended up in my possession after his death. Why would you have my father's evidence? Because 15 years ago, the Steinbergs tried to pressure my family into joining their development schemes. When we refused, they made it clear that cooperation wasn't optional. Damien's voice hardened. Your father's investigation was the best chance anyone had of stopping them legally. After he died, I made sure his work didn't disappear completely. Evangeline stared at the man across from her, trying to reconcile what she was learning with everything she thought she knew about her father's death and her own life. You've had this information for 15 years and never did anything with it. I've been waiting for the right opportunity. The Steinbergs are still powerful, still dangerous. Going after them requires perfect timing and ironclad evidence. Damien stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. I didn't expect that opportunity to walk into my house during a thunderstorm. Evangeline spent the next hour reading through every document in the files, her anger building with each piece of evidence her father had collected. By the time she finished, she understood why someone had wanted him dead. Marcus Thorne hadn't just been investigating corruption. He'd been building a federal case that would have dismantled the Steinberg organization and exposed 3 decades of bribery, intimidation, and fraud. Damien had remained silent during her review, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. When she finally looked up from the papers, his expression was unreadable. The Steinbergs killed my father because he found out they were stealing federal development funds, she said. It wasn't a question. Your father found out they were doing a lot more than that. Damien turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. The federal development money was just the beginning. They've been using city planning decisions to force property sales for 20 years. Anyone who refused to cooperate found their businesses failing due to mysterious permit problems, unexpected inspections, or visits from people who made it clear that accidents could happen. And your family just watched this happen? My family provided security services to people who couldn't get protection from the police. Damien's voice was carefully controlled. When the Steinbergs started pressuring us to work exclusively for them, to help them intimidate property owners instead of protecting them, we refused. Evangeline studied his face, looking for signs of deception. That must have made you enemies. It made us targets. Damien picked up one of the police reports from her father's accident. 3 weeks after your father died, my uncle's restaurant burned down. Official cause was faulty wiring, but the fire started in 4 different locations simultaneously. A month after that, my cousin's construction business lost every city contract they had, despite being the lowest bidder. So you've been fighting the Steinbergs for 15 years? I've been surviving them for 15 years. There's a difference. Damien set the report back on the desk. Fighting them requires evidence that will hold up in federal court, witnesses who are willing to testify, and investigators who can't be bought or intimidated. Your father was building that case when he died. Evangeline's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but the message was clear. Leave town today or find out what happened to your father. She showed the phone to Damien, who read the message without any change in expression. That was faster than I expected, he said. You expected this? I expected someone to notice that Marcus Thorne's daughter was asking questions about historical properties in Shadowmere Heights. Damien walked to the library door and locked it, then moved to check that the windows were secure. The Steinbergs have people watching City Hall, the police station, and every hotel in town. Word that you're here would have reached them within hours. Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. They know where I am right now. They know you spent the night here, and they know you're conducting an official assessment of my property. Damien returned to the desk and began gathering the documents. What they don't know yet is whether you've discovered anything that poses a threat to them. But I have discovered something. I've discovered that they murdered my father. You've discovered that your father was investigating them when he died. Proving murder requires evidence that doesn't exist anymore. Damien locked the documents in a desk drawer and pocketed the key. The police reports were sanitized, the insurance investigation was closed, and most of the sources your father was protecting have either left town or died of natural causes. Evangeline's phone buzzed again. This time the message included a photo of her rental car at Morrison's garage with a red circle drawn around the license plate. They're watching me. They're watching everyone. Damien moved closer to her. close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept scanning the windows. The question is what you plan to do about it. I plan to finish what my father started. That's what I was afraid you'd say. Damien reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing along her cheek. Your father was a trained investigative journalist with law enforcement contacts and federal sources. He still ended up dead. The touch sent electricity through Evangeline's entire body. She should step back, maintain professional distance, but something about the way he was looking at her made movement impossible. Are you trying to scare me into leaving? I'm trying to keep you alive. His voice was barely above a whisper now. Because the alternative is watching you end up like everyone else who's tried to take down the Steinbergs. Everyone else. 3 journalists, 2 FBI agents, a state prosecutor, and at least a dozen business owners who refused to cooperate. Damien's hand moved to the back of her neck. Some died in accidents. Others just disappeared. A few were found in the river months later. Evangeline could feel her pulse racing where his fingers touched her skin. And you've been collecting evidence all this time, waiting for what exactly? For someone with the skill and resources to use it properly. Someone the Steinbergs couldn't buy or intimidate. His other hand came up to frame her face. I didn't expect that person to be Marcus Thorne's daughter. Maybe that's exactly who it was supposed to be. The space between them disappeared so gradually that Evangeline wasn't sure who moved first. When Damien's lips touched hers, it was with a gentleness that contradicted everything she'd heard about his reputation. The kiss deepened slowly, carefully, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. When they finally broke apart, Evangeline could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability, maybe, or fear. This changes everything, she said. This complicates everything. Damien stepped back, running a hand through his hair. The Steinbergs already want you gone. If they think you're working with me, if they think I'm sharing information with you, then we better make sure we're ready for whatever they do next. 2 hours after the threatening text messages began, Damien's phone rang with a call that made his entire body tense. Evangeline watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end, his expression growing darker with each passing second. How many? He asked quietly. When he hung up and immediately began moving around the library, checking window locks and pulling heavy curtains closed. What's happening? 3 black SUVs just pulled into the driveway. Steinberg security. Damien opened the desk drawer and pulled out a handgun, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. They're not here for a social visit. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. Should we call the police? Half the police department is on the Steinberg payroll. The other half knows better than to interfere in family business. Damien moved to another window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Mrs. Chun and the staff left through the kitchen entrance 10 minutes ago. Standard protocol when we have uninvited guests. Standard protocol? Welcome to my world, Evangeline. Damien's voice was grim. The world your father was trying to expose before they killed him. A heavy knock echoed through the mansion, followed by the sound of the front door opening without invitation. Footsteps moved across the marble foyer, too many to count, spreading through the first floor with military precision. Time for some truth. Damien holstered the gun under his jacket and sat down across from her again. My great-grandfather started what he called a protection service in the 1920s. Legitimate business owners paid us to keep their shops safe from gangs and corrupt cops. By the time my father inherited the operation, we controlled security for most of downtown Shadowmere Heights. More footsteps, closer now. Someone was climbing the main staircase. Protection became territory. Territory became influence. Influence became power. Damien kept his voice low, but his eyes never left the library door. For 3 generations, the Valerian family has been the unofficial law in this town. Not always legal, but not entirely criminal either. And now I'm trying to transition everything into legitimate businesses. Security consulting, property management, business loans through proper banks instead of backroom deals. Damien's jaw tightened. The Steinbergs want me to go the other direction. They want access to our territory, our contacts, our ability to make problems disappear. The footsteps stopped outside the library door. Evangeline could hear low voices conferring in the hallway. What kind of problems? The kind your father represented. Journalists who ask too many questions. Federal investigators who can't be bought. Property owners who refuse to sell. Damien reached across the desk and took her hand. Business owners who insist on following environmental regulations instead of fast-tracking development projects. The door handle turned slowly. Damien squeezed her hand once, then released it and stood up. Mr. Valerian. The man who entered was tall and lean, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the shoulder holster underneath. Two larger men flanked him, their hands resting casually near their jacket openings. Sorry to interrupt your business meeting. Marcus Steinberg. Damien's tone was conversational, but Evangeline could see the tension in his shoulders. I wasn't expecting you personally. Family business requires a personal touch. Marcus's eyes moved to Evangeline, lingering on her face with uncomfortable intensity. Miss Thorne, isn't it? You have your father's eyes. Evangeline forced herself to remain seated, to project calm she didn't feel. Mr. Steinberg, I knew your father well. Brilliant journalist. Such a tragedy when he died so young. Marcus smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. I understand you're following in his footsteps, asking questions about local history. I'm conducting a historical assessment for the city planning department. Of course you are. Marcus walked closer to the desk, his movements casual but predatory. I'm curious what kind of historical documents you might have discovered during your research. Damien stepped slightly closer to Evangeline's chair. Miss Thorne is evaluating the architectural significance of the building, nothing more. I'm sure she is. Marcus picked up a pen from the desk and examined it as if it were fascinating. The thing about historical research is that sometimes people find documents that were never meant to be preserved. Old newspapers, investigative notes, police reports that should have been destroyed years ago. I wouldn't know anything about that. I think you would, actually. Marcus set the pen down and looked directly at Damien. I think you've been holding on to things that don't belong to you for a very long time. I think Miss Thorne's arrival has given you ideas about what you might do with those things. You're paranoid, Marcus. I'm careful. There's a difference. Marcus gestured to his men, who moved closer to the desk. Careful enough to know that Marcus Thorne's daughter showing up in Shadowmere Heights isn't a coincidence. Careful enough to know that the city planning department doesn't usually send single investigators to conduct historical assessments without backup staff or official vehicles. Evangeline's mouth went dry. My car broke down. Your car was sabotaged. Marcus's smile widened. By us. 3 blocks from here, just like your father's car was sabotaged 15 years ago. The difference is that this time, we're giving you a choice. The room fell silent except for the sound of Evangeline's heart pounding in her ears. Leave town tonight. Forget whatever you think you've discovered. Forget about historical assessments and architectural significance and your father's old investigation. Marcus leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. Do that, and you get to live a long, happy life somewhere far away from here. And if I don't, then you'll have the same accident your father had. Tragic brake failure on a dangerous stretch of highway. Marcus straightened up, adjusting his tie. Mr. Valerian will be devastated, of course. Probably blame himself for not protecting his houseguest properly. Damien's hand moved toward his jacket, but Marcus's men were faster. Both had guns drawn before he could complete the motion. I wouldn't if I were you. Marcus's voice remained conversational. Miss Thorne, you have until midnight to be out of Shadowmere Heights permanently. Mr. Valerian, you have until the end of the week to decide whether you're ready to be a partner instead of a competitor. After Marcus Steinberg and his men left, Evangeline and Damien sat in silence for several minutes. The library felt different now, charged with the electricity of revealed threats and dangerous possibilities. Damien had poured them both drinks from a bottle of whiskey he kept in the desk drawer, but neither had touched the amber liquid. We need those documents your father collected, Damien said finally. All of them, not just the copies I have, but the original evidence he was building for his federal case. You said his sources disappeared or died. His sources, yes, but not his evidence. Damien pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. Your father was too smart to keep everything in one place. He would have had backup files, maybe multiple copies hidden in different locations. Evangeline thought about the articles she'd read, the meticulous way her father had documented every connection, every suspicious transaction. He was paranoid about losing his work. Always made copies of everything, stored them in different places. Did he ever mention where? Not directly, but he had habits. Evangeline stood up and began pacing, trying to remember details from 15 years ago. He kept important documents in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Said it was the one place he could be sure they'd be safe from fire or theft. Damien's eyes sharpened. Do you have access to that box? I don't know. After he died, my aunt handled all his affairs. She never mentioned a safety deposit box, but then again, she was mainly concerned with paying for his funeral and settling his debts. Evangeline stopped pacing. Why would she have known about it anyway? He never told anyone his personal business. Because he was protecting you. Damien set down his untouched whiskey. Think about it. If the Steinbergs killed him for what he knew, they would have searched his house, his office, anywhere they thought he might have kept evidence. But a safety deposit box requires specific legal procedures to access after someone's death. Unless he set it up so that I could access it when I turned 18. Or when you turned 30. Damien was already reaching for his jacket. How old are you now? I turned 30 last month. They drove to First National Bank in Damien's black Mercedes, taking a circuitous route through residential neighborhoods while he checked his mirrors for surveillance. The bank sat on Main Street in a building that looked like it had been constructed around the same time as Crimson Hall, all red brick and brass fixtures that spoke of old money and older secrets. The manager was a thin woman in her 50s who recognized Damien immediately and seemed nervous about his presence in her bank. When Evangeline explained that she was looking for information about a safety deposit box that might have been rented by her deceased father, the woman's nervousness increased. I'll need to check our records, she said, leading them to a small office behind the main lobby. What was your father's full name and approximate date of death? Marcus James Thorne. He died March 15, 2008. The manager typed information into her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. After several minutes, she frowned at the screen. There is a safety deposit box registered under that name, but it has some unusual access restrictions. She looked up at Evangeline. It's programmed to allow access only to Evangeline Marie Thorne, and only after March 1st, 2024. Evangeline's birthday. Her 30th birthday. Can I access it now? I'll need to see identification and verify your signature against the card on file. The manager seemed reluctant, glancing nervously at Damien. Mr. Valerian, I should mention that this type of restricted access arrangement is very unusual. Most people don't plan that far in advance. My father was a careful man, Evangeline said. 20 minutes later, they were in the bank's vault, standing in front of a wall of small metal doors. The manager used 2 keys to open box 247, then discreetly withdrew to give them privacy. Inside the narrow metal drawer, Evangeline found a thick manila envelope, several cassette tapes, and a smaller sealed envelope with her name written on it in her father's handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened the letter. My dearest Evangeline, it began. If you're reading this, it means you've reached your 30th birthday and something has happened to me. I pray that you're reading this because you're curious about your inheritance, not because you've stumbled into the same investigation that cost me my life. Evangeline's vision blurred. Damien moved closer, reading over her shoulder. I've been investigating corruption in Shadowmere Heights for 3 years. What started as a simple story about development fraud has become something much larger and more dangerous. The Steinberg family has been using violence and intimidation to control city planning decisions for decades, but they're not working alone. They have partners in the police department, the mayor's office, and at least 3 federal agencies. The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing evidence that Marcus had collected and hidden in various locations around the city. But it was the final paragraph that made Evangeline gasp. By the time you read this, I will have attempted to fake my own death to protect you and give me time to build a case that can't be ignored or buried. I've arranged for evidence to be sent to federal investigators if anything happens to me, but I know the Steinbergs have people everywhere. If my plan fails, if they find me before I can complete the case, then this box contains everything you need to finish what I started. Trust no one in local law enforcement. Trust no one in city government. But if Damien Valerian is still alive, if he's still fighting them, then you can trust him. His family has been protecting this town from people like the Steinbergs for longer than anyone remembers. Evangeline looked up at Damien, whose expression had gone very still. He mentions you specifically. Keep reading. I've been working with Damien to gather evidence against the Steinbergs. He saved my life twice, and his family's resources are the only reason I've been able to investigate this long without being killed. If something happens to me, he'll know how to use what's in this box. The manila envelope contained photocopies of financial records, bank statements showing regular payments from Steinberg Construction to city officials, and what appeared to be transcripts of recorded conversations. The cassette tapes were labeled with dates and names, including several conversations between Marcus Steinberg and police officers discussing how to handle problem property owners. But the most damaging evidence was a recording labeled MS Confession, March 10, 2008. 5 days before your father's death, Damien noted. They found a cassette player in the bank manager's office. Marcus Steinberg's voice came through clearly, discussing payment schedules for city officials and detailing specific instances where violence had been used against uncooperative business owners. But more importantly, he discussed plans to eliminate Marcus Thorne permanently. The journalist has become too dangerous to ignore, Steinberg's voice said. He has evidence that could destroy everything we've built. We need to stage an accident, make it look like brake failure or steering problems. Something that won't trigger a federal investigation. Evangeline closed her eyes, finally hearing confirmation of what she'd suspected since reading her father's articles. He tried to fake his own death, but they found him anyway, she whispered. Your father was a brave man, Damien said quietly, and he left you everything you need to destroy them. The FBI field office in Albany was a 3-hour drive from Shadowmere Heights, but Damien insisted they take a longer route through back roads to avoid detection. They'd spent the previous night digitizing every document from the safety deposit box, creating multiple backup copies that Damien distributed to contacts he trusted in 3 different states. Insurance policy, he'd explained. If something happens to us, if we disappear, these people know to deliver everything to federal prosecutors. Now, sitting in the passenger seat of Damien's Mercedes as he navigated winding mountain roads, Evangeline clutched the original evidence against her chest. The cassette tapes were in a reinforced case, the financial records in waterproof folders, and her father's letter sealed in plastic. 15 years of waiting were about to end. Tell me about the FBI agent we're meeting, she said. Special Agent Sarah Chun. No relation to Mrs. Chun, despite the name. Damien checked his mirrors again, a habit that had become constant since leaving the bank. She's been investigating organized crime in upstate New York for 8 years. Clean record, no connections to anyone in Shadowmere Heights. How do you know her? I don't. But Marcus did. Damien's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Your father had been in contact with her for months before he died. She was supposed to be his federal contact, the person who would have received his evidence if he'd lived long enough to deliver it. Evangeline's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Wrong choice, Miss Thorne. Final warning. She showed the message to Damien, who pulled over at the next rest stop and got out to check the car thoroughly. When he returned, his expression was grim. GPS tracker under the rear bumper. They've been following us since we left the bank. He held up a small electronic device. Question is whether they're just watching or planning something more direct. Can we remove it? Already did. But that means they know exactly where we are and where we're headed. Damien started the engine again. We need to change the plan. What do you mean change the plan? I mean we can't lead them straight to Agent Chun. If the Steinbergs are willing to kill federal agents, meeting her puts her life in danger too. Damien pulled back onto the highway, but turned in the opposite direction from Albany. We need a public place, somewhere with witnesses and security cameras. They drove to the Crossgates Mall in Albany, parking near the main entrance where dozens of other cars provided cover. Damien had called Agent Chun during the drive, arranging to meet her in the food court at exactly 3 p.m. The plan was simple. Hand over the evidence in a crowded public space, then disappear while she took it to federal prosecutors. Stay close to me, Damien said as they walked through the mall entrance. If anything feels wrong, if you see anyone who looks out of place, we leave immediately. The food court was busy with afternoon shoppers and teenagers cutting school. Agent Chun was exactly where she'd said she would be, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of all entrances. She was younger than Evangeline had expected, maybe 40, with short black hair and the kind of alert posture that suggested she was constantly evaluating threats. Miss Thorne. Agent Chun stood as they approached, shaking hands with both of them. Mr. Valerian, I have to say, when you called about evidence related to Marcus Thorne's death, I thought it might be another dead end. It's not a dead end, Evangeline said, setting the evidence case on the table. It's everything my father died trying to expose. Agent Chen opened the case and quickly examined the contents, her expression growing more serious with each document she reviewed. This is substantial. Financial records, recorded conversations, testimony. She looked up at Damien. How long have you had this? 15 years. I've been waiting for the right moment to surface it. And you think that moment is now? I think the Steinbergs are about to escalate their operations, Damien replied. They're pressuring legitimate businesses to join their organization, and they're eliminating anyone who refuses to cooperate. Miss Thorne's investigation gave them a timeline to act. Agent Chun was examining the cassette tapes when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her expression changed instantly. We have a problem. She looked around the food court, her hand moving instinctively toward her jacket. My office just got a call from someone claiming to be holding Evangeline Thorne hostage. They want to arrange an exchange. Exchange for what? Evangeline asked, but even as the words left her mouth, she understood. For the evidence. Agent Chin began packing the documents back into the case. They want me to bring everything to a warehouse address in Shadowmere Heights at 5 p.m., or they start sending pieces of you to your relatives. Damien was already scanning the crowd, looking for threats. How did they know we were meeting you? Same way they knew to put a tracker on your car. Someone's been watching both of you very carefully. Agent Chin closed the case. The question is whether we're dealing with a legitimate kidnapping threat or a bluff designed to get their hands on this evidence. That's when Evangeline saw them. 3 men in dark suits moving through the crowd with purpose, their eyes focused on their table. She recognized one of them from the library confrontation at Crimson Hall. They're here, she said quietly. Damien followed her gaze and immediately stood up. Back exit. Now. But it was too late. The men had positioned themselves at all 3 exits from the food court, and more were filtering in through the main mall corridors. Agent Chin drew her weapon, keeping it low and out of sight from other shoppers. FBI, she said into her phone. I need backup at Crossgates Mall, food court level. Multiple suspects, possible kidnapping in progress. Put the gun away, Agent Chun. Marcus Steinberg's voice came from behind them. He was standing near the counter of a pizza restaurant, flanked by 2 more men. We're all civilized people here. No need for violence in front of children. Agent Chin kept her weapon ready, but didn't raise it. Marcus Steinberg, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and murder. I'm here to collect my property. Marcus gestured toward the evidence case. Property that was stolen from me 15 years ago by a man who didn't understand the consequences of theft. This evidence proves you murdered my father, Evangeline said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. This evidence proves that your father was building a case based on illegally obtained recordings and forged documents. Marcus smiled. Documents that will never see the inside of a courtroom because they were acquired through criminal trespass and stolen from private property. Damien moved slightly in front of Evangeline. The recordings are authentic. The financial records came from legitimate sources. Prove it. Marcus's smile widened. But you can't, because the only people who could verify the authenticity of those recordings are dead. The only people who could confirm the source of those financial records are dead. Your father made sure of that when he started his investigation. Agent Chin's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, and Evangeline saw her face go pale. What? Damien asked. Photo message. Someone tied up in what looks like a warehouse. Agent Chin showed them the screen. Woman, approximately 30 years old, brown hair. They're saying it's Evangeline Thorne. Evangeline stared at the photo. The woman did look remarkably similar to her. Same hair color, same general build. But it wasn't her. Who is that? Someone who's about to become a very unfortunate victim of mistaken identity, Marcus said. Unless, of course, Agent Chin decides that preserving one life is worth more than pursuing a case based on 15-year-old evidence that may or may not be admissible in court. The trap was perfect. If Agent Chun kept the evidence, an innocent woman would die. If she handed it over, the Steinbergs would destroy it and walk away free. And there was no way to verify whether the kidnapping was real without risking an innocent life. You have 30 minutes to decide, Marcus continued. Bring the evidence to the warehouse address we sent. Come alone, and the woman lives. Try to set up a sting operation, try to bring backup, or try to verify the authenticity of our threat, and she dies. He turned and walked away, his men following in a coordinated withdrawal that left no opportunity for pursuit. Within minutes, the food court had returned to normal, leaving Evangeline, Damien, and Agent Chun sitting with evidence that had suddenly become worthless as a bargaining chip. "We can't let an innocent person die," Evangeline said finally. "And we can't let 15 years of evidence disappear," Agent Chun replied. "There has to be another option." Damien was studying the photo on Agent Chun's phone. "There is, but it requires one of us to make a choice that's going to hurt." Damien's plan was both simple and terrifying. While Agent Chun delivered a fake evidence case to the warehouse, he and Evangeline would infiltrate the Steinberg compound through a route he'd mapped years earlier during his own surveillance operations. The real evidence would go directly to federal prosecutors in New York City via courier, ensuring it couldn't be destroyed even if everything went wrong. "The warehouse meeting is a setup," Damien explained as they drove through the industrial district of Shadowmere Heights. "Marcus wants Agent Chun isolated so he can eliminate the federal threat and recover the evidence simultaneously. But he's also paranoid enough to keep his real operations separate from the trap." "How do you know where the real operations are?" "Because I've been watching the Steinbergs as long as they've been watching me." Damien pulled into an abandoned gas station and killed the engine. "Their actual headquarters is in the old textile mill on the east side of town. That's where they'll have taken whoever that woman in the photo really is." Agent Chun had coordinated with her Albany office to stage the warehouse meeting, complete with tactical backup positioned around the building. The plan was to arrest Marcus and his men when they arrived, but Damien suspected the Steinbergs were too smart to show up in person. "What if we're wrong?" Evangeline asked as they walked through the shadows toward the textile mill. "What if the kidnapping is real and we're letting someone die? Then we save her and make sure the Steinbergs pay for 15 years of murder and corruption." Damien checked his gun one more time. "Your father would have wanted both." The textile mill loomed against the night sky like a Gothic cathedral, its broken windows and crumbling brick facade testament to Shadowmere Heights' industrial decline. But there were lights in several windows, and cars parked in what should have been an abandoned lot. They entered through a loading dock that Damien had scouted months earlier, moving quietly through corridors that smelled of machine oil and decay. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, along with the occasional sound of footsteps on metal stairs. "Second floor," Damien whispered. "That's where Marcus keeps his office." They climbed a rusted fire escape to a window that had been boarded up but not secured. Through gaps in the wood, Evangeline could see into a large room that had been converted into a makeshift headquarters. Maps of Shadowmere Heights covered one wall, marked with red pins and handwritten notes. File cabinets lined another wall, and a large desk dominated the center of the space. Marcus Steinberg sat behind the desk, talking on a cell phone, while two men stood guard near the door. In a chair facing away from the window sat a woman with brown hair tied back, her hands secured behind her. "I can see her," Evangeline breathed. "She's alive." Damien was already working on the window boards, prying them loose with a crowbar he'd brought. "When I give the signal, call Agent Chun and tell her to move on the warehouse. The real operation is here." The first board came loose with a soft creaking sound. One of the guards looked up, scanning the room, but didn't seem to notice anything wrong. Damien worked on the second board while Evangeline watched the men below. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Damien," she whispered urgently, "look at the woman's face." The woman in the chair had turned slightly, giving them a profile view. It wasn't just someone who resembled Evangeline. It was her Aunt Linda, her father's sister who had helped raise her after his death. They didn't grab a random woman, Evangeline realized. They grabbed my family. Damien's expression hardened. "Which means they've been planning this longer than we thought." The window boards were loose enough now for them to slip through, but the room below offered no cover and multiple armed guards. Damien pulled out his phone and sent a text to Agent Chun. "Real location. Textile mill, east side. Multiple suspects, confirmed hostage. Move now." Then he turned to Evangeline. "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When the shooting starts, you run. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Just get out of here and let the FBI handle it." "I'm not leaving you. You're not losing anyone else to these people." Damien's voice was firm. "Your father died for this evidence. I'm not letting you die for revenge." Before Evangeline could argue, the sound of vehicles approaching the building echoed through the night air. Marcus looked up from his phone call, barking orders to his men. Two guards moved to the windows while another headed for the stairs. FBI backup, Damien said. This is it. He kicked out the remaining window boards and dropped into the room, gun drawn. Federal agents. Nobody moved. The chaos that followed seemed to unfold in slow motion. Marcus dove behind his desk as his guards scrambled for cover. Evangeline followed Damien through the window, ignoring his orders to run, and immediately went for her Aunt Linda's chair. Evangeline. Linda's voice was weak but alert. What are you doing here? Getting you out. Evangeline worked on the ropes, binding her aunt's hands while gunfire erupted around them. Damien had taken cover behind a file cabinet, exchanging shots with one of the guards while more FBI agents stormed up the stairs. Your father's evidence. Linda gasped as the ropes came loose. Marcus made me tell him where it was. I'm sorry, I couldn't. It's okay. We have everything we need. Agent Chin's voice echoed from the stairwell. FBI? Building is surrounded. Drop your weapons. Marcus Steinberg emerged from behind his desk with his hands raised, but his expression showed more calculation than defeat. Agent Chun, I assume you've discovered that the warehouse was empty. Marcus Steinberg, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, racketeering, and the murder of Marcus Thorne. Agent Chin kept her weapon trained on him while other agents secured the room. Murder is a serious accusation. I hope you have evidence to support it. We have 15 years of evidence, Evangeline said, helping her aunt to her feet. Recordings, financial records, testimony from my father's investigation. Everything he died trying to expose. Evidence obtained through illegal trespass and theft. Evidence that will never see the inside of a courtroom. Marcus smiled, even as Agent Chin cuffed him. My lawyers will have this case dismissed before you finish the paperwork. Your lawyers won't be able to dismiss federal racketeering charges based on financial records obtained through legitimate law enforcement channels, Agent Chin replied, or the testimony from 3 former associates who've agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus's smile faltered. What associates? The ones who contacted the FBI 6 months ago when they realized you were planning to expand operations to include murdering federal agents. Agent Chin gestured to her backup agents. Your organization has been under federal surveillance since January. Miss Thorne's investigation just gave us the final pieces we needed for prosecution. As the FBI led Marcus and his men away in handcuffs, Evangeline found herself standing in the ruined textile mill with Damien and her aunt, surrounded by the wreckage of a 15-year conspiracy. The evidence that had cost her father his life was finally in the hands of people who could use it for justice. It's over, she said quietly. The criminal case is over, Damien corrected. Everything else is just beginning. 6 months later, Evangeline stood in the restored library of Crimson Hall, now officially designated as a historic landmark and converted into a museum dedicated to investigative journalism and government transparency. The Marcus Thorne Memorial Research Center occupied the entire second floor, complete with her father's original articles and the evidence that had brought down the Steinberg organization. Damien appeared in the doorway wearing a dark suit and carrying 2 glasses of champagne. The city council just voted unanimously to fund the research center for the next 10 years, he announced. Your father's work is going to help train a new generation of investigative journalists. And your work? Converting the family business into legitimate security consulting? Easier than I expected, now that the Steinbergs aren't around to complicate things. Damien handed her a glass and raised his own. To justice delayed but not denied. To new beginnings, Evangeline countered. They touched glasses, the crystal ringing softly in the quiet library. Through the tall windows, the lights of Shadowmere Heights sparkled in the distance, no longer representing corruption and fear, but possibility and hope. So, Damien said, setting down his glass and pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. I have one more new beginning to propose. Evangeline's heart stopped as he dropped to one knee in the same library where they'd first discovered the truth about her father's death. Evangeline Thorne, will you marry me? The answer came without hesitation, backed by certainty that had been building since the night she'd stumbled into his house during a thunderstorm. Yes. 3 months later, they were married in the mansion's restored garden, surrounded by friends, family, and the journalists who had come to cover the wedding of the woman who'd exposed one of the largest corruption scandals in state history. As they danced under strings of lights that turned Crimson Hall into something magical, Evangeline realized that sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst storms. Her father's legacy lived on in the research center that bore his name. The Steinberg organization was dismantled completely, its assets forfeited to the federal government. And Damien Valerian, once the most feared man in Shadowmere Heights, had become its most respected citizen, standing in the arms of the man she loved. In the house where she discovered both truth and love, Evangeline knew that some battles are worth fighting, especially when they lead to happy endings that honor the sacrifices of those who came before.